This is the only cinematic film made on Omaha Beach during the early hours of D-Day on June 6, 1944. The man responsible for the photos and film was Sergeant Richard Taylor, a cameraman from the Signal Corps. To give you an idea, he was wounded in the arm while filming the events of that morning and still continued to film until he could be evacuated. Today we are going to see D-Day through real images, and you will see that things were much more brutal than what you see in movies out there. Get ready! In the spring of 1944, things looked grim for Nazi Germany. Already deprived of essential resources and under heavy pressure in the east, the Western Allies were ready to launch their long-awaited invasion of Western Europe. And yet, Germany's leader, Adolf Hitler, despite everything, was eager for D-Day. His plan was simple: reinforce the Western defenses, launch a furious counterattack, and drive the Allies back into the sea. After that, he could concentrate all his strength against the Soviet Union and end the war. For Hitler, the outcome of this campaign would be decisive. I know you've seen several videos about D-Day, but have you ever wondered, why were some beaches bloodier than others? Or why did the German counterattacks fail? Or why did it take so long for the Allies to break through and advance into France? The Allied landing site would be Normandy, but with a large deception operation to focus German eyes on Pas-de-Calais. Airborne forces would secure the flanks, while assault forces would land with the Americans on the right and British and Commonwealth forces on the left. Instead of capturing a major port, Morgan also decided on the ingenious solution of bringing two prefabricated ports across the channel to supply the Allied breakout. When Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed commander of SHAEF and Sir Bernard Montgomery commander of the Allied ground forces in December 1943, the responsibility for Overlord passed to them. But the only major change they made was to increase the strength of the airborne and seaborne landings. With a wider front, the first target would be Caen, and after that, the port of Cherbourg. After surviving the inevitable German counterattack, Montgomery hoped the Germans would retreat to defensive positions along the Seine River within 3 months of the landings. But this did not mean that this campaign would be easy. The divisions chosen to carry out the invasion were reinforced with additional units. Both British and Commonwealth forces and the Americans were equipped with dual-drive tanks, or DD tanks, that could swim to shore. Meanwhile, the British were further reinforced with specialized armor. Instead of facing enemy tanks, the tanks that landed on the beaches were primarily intended to provide fire support to the infantry, suppressing bunkers and enemy gun positions. Many of them were the so-called funny tanks, like this one, which were conceived by Major General Sir Percy Hobart. This Churchill AVRE Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers was equipped with what was known as a spigot mortar instead of a standard tank gun, allowing it to fire large explosive charges capable of destroying bunkers and pillboxes. It could also be equipped with various attachments that helped move other vehicles across the beach, or large bundles of wood known as fascines, used to fill in trenches and ditches. While the enormous invasion force gathered in Britain, including a completely fake army group ready to attack Calais, the Germans were strengthening their defenses. At this point in the war, the German Air Force and Navy were already virtually exhausted. Thus, the defense of the Fortress Europe fell on the German army, particularly Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel believed that Germany's best chance to contain an invasion would be to stop the Allies at the water's edge, at the much-vaunted Atlantic Wall. Started in 1942, it was still far from complete. But from early 1944 onward, Rommel oversaw a massive strengthening of existing fortifications, adding pillboxes, gun positions, beach obstacles, and millions of mines, many of them in the Normandy sector. The units tasked with holding these positions varied as much as the defenses themselves. Although there were 58 German divisions in the theater by May 1944, many of them were low-quality garrison troops, from which the fittest and most capable had been sent to the meat grinder in the east. The destruction of the invaders would fall on the 9 Panzer divisions and 1 Panzer Grenadier division in the theater, totaling 1,400 tanks and self-propelled guns. The only problem was that Rommel had no control over them. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commander of all German army forces in the West, and General Geyer von Schweppenberg, commander of the Armored Reserve Panzer Group West, disagreed with Rommel. They advocated a defense-in-depth strategy, keeping the panzers farther back. Rommel wanted the panzers positioned much closer to the likely landing sites. He knew the Allies had air superiority, which would significantly restrict movement in the maneuver battle favored by Rundstedt and Schweppenberg. Moreover, if the Allies established a beachhead, their vast resources in men and material would ensure they could wear down Germany's finite resources by continually feeding new divisions into France. In the end, after the argument was taken to Hitler, a tactically unsustainable compromise was reached. Of the total of 9 panzer divisions and 1 panzer grenadier division in the West, Rommel would receive 3. Von Schweppenberg would keep 4 in reserve, while the remaining 3 would be sent to southern France as part of the new Army Group G. Hitler also stipulated that Panzer Group West could only be deployed with his permission, which would prove costly for the Germans on D-Day. D-Day was scheduled for June 5, 1944. However, in the days leading up to it, terrible weather conditions forced Eisenhower to postpone the invasion by 24 hours. This was a difficult decision, as any delay would make it increasingly difficult to keep the operation secret. But over the course of June 4th and 5th, meteorologists predicted a brief improvement in the weather, and based on this information, Eisenhower ordered the invasion to proceed on June 6th. This is the letter issued to thousands of troops en route to Normandy on the eve of the invasion, written by Supreme Commander Eisenhower. In it, he says that the task will not be easy, that the enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. But Eisenhower also states that he has full confidence in the courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle of the troops, and that nothing less than full victory will be acceptable. For the men who received this letter, there were, of course, mixed feelings. But the mood was incredibly well captured by then Major James Robert Morgan, who was second in command of the 12th British Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment. In this letter to his wife, written on the back of Eisenhower's message, Morgan says, "I'm immensely anxious about the next few hours. Right now I look like Santa Claus, all geared up, with binoculars hanging on my chest. Well, darling, I'll be back with you too soon. Save some tomatoes for me and keep this letter as a reminder of an amazing event in history. All my love, Jim." The first Allied troops to land in Normandy were the British and Canadian airborne forces of the 6th Airborne Division. Landing by glider and parachute to the east of Sword Beach, their main task was to capture and hold key bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. Despite scattered landings, they managed to capture their objectives, but to hold them, the lightly armed troops would have to defend against German armored counterattacks. The American forces landed shortly after the British and Canadian forces. The main landing site for the Americans was Omaha Beach, where they faced fierce German resistance. The German forces on the beaches were mostly composed of infantry units and some tanks, but the main resistance was in fortified defensive positions, including the famous pillboxes and other fortifications along the coast. The fighting on the beaches was brutal. The Allies suffered heavy losses as they tried to establish a beachhead and push inland. For the Americans, the situation was particularly difficult at Omaha, where the landing forces were heavily attacked by artillery and machine gun fire. Even with air and naval support, Allied troops encountered immense resistance. The battle scenes were chaotic, with soldiers trying to advance under a constant rain of bullets and explosions. The first objective of Montgomery and Eisenhower was to establish a secure defensive line and ensure the capture of key cities, such as Caen, which was seen as essential to the continuation of the offensive. However, the German resistance was much stronger than expected, and the fight for the city dragged on for weeks. The city of Caen was eventually captured, but not without great cost and difficulty. The Allied forces were now establishing a solid beachhead, but the path into the interior of France was still far from secure. The German counterattacks, though well executed, failed to stop the Allied advance. The lack of coordination among German commanders and the fact that the Wehrmacht was largely worn down by the fighting in the east and by shortages of essential resources, also contributed to the failure of the counterattacks. The Allied troops, despite heavy initial losses, began to gain ground, using their air and naval superiority to wear down the German forces. As the Allied forces advanced, the battlefield in Normandy spread into the interior of France. The battles remained fierce, but the strategic situation was beginning to shift in favor of the Allies. German forces were slowly being pushed back, and Allied supply lines were finally being established, allowing more troops and supplies to be sent to the continent. The importance of D-Day cannot be underestimated. Although the subsequent battles in Normandy were long and difficult, the success of the Allied landing marked the turning point of World War II. From that moment on, the Allied forces began advancing toward Germany, while the Nazi regime found itself increasingly surrounded and in retreat. Short pause to the west. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were landing on the Cotentin Peninsula behind Omaha Beach. They were to secure the exits that would allow the amphibious troops, who would land later in the morning, to move toward the vital port of Cherbourg. The drop zones were supposed to be marked by elite pathfinders ahead of the main force, who used special radar transmitters known as Eurekas to guide them. But when they jumped, a massive cloud had formed over the Cotentin Peninsula, causing many of the pathfinders to miss their target. And when they landed, many were unable to get the Eurekas working. The result was chaos. Many of the jumps were widely scattered. For example, most of the 2nd Battalion, 52nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, jumped over the wrong drop zone and spent most of D-Day trying to regroup. However, others who landed in the wrong place managed to improvise and form groups that were a mix of units and moved on to achieve their objectives. Although the American airborne drops didn't go exactly as planned, they caused chaos and confusion among the German defenders and secured the exits from Omaha Beach. Now, the Allied aerial and naval bombardment of the beach defenses had begun. The volume of fire was enormous, but the results were inconsistent. The strong points that survived inflicted a heavy cost. At Omaha Beach, the landings were a huge success. The troops were accidentally landed well south of their designated landing zone, in an area that was only lightly defended. Quick-thinking commanders took advantage of this, and by 10 a.m., all enemy resistance had been eliminated, with only 197 casualties. A few miles to the east, however, the landing at Omaha Beach turned into a bloodbath. Of the 5 invasion beaches, Omaha was undoubtedly the most challenging. Most of the 6-mile beach was overlooked by steep cliffs, about 45 meters high, which gave the German strongpoints excellent fields of vision and fire over an area filled with mines, obstacles, and barbed wire. The only way through the cliffs was via 5 ravines known as exits. Of course, the Germans knew how important these exits were, and they had literally been turned into death traps. This weapon here was extremely important. Take a look. We're looking at the infamous MG-42 machine gun. Well, this was designed to be a universal machine gun, and it fulfilled that role. Its efficient design allowed it to be used both as a light machine gun and in more strategic roles, especially in defensive situations. One of the most striking moments in which the MG-42 demonstrated its effectiveness was during D-Day on Omaha Beach. It stood out for its belt-fed system, ideal for providing sustained and suppressive fire. This feature was crucial for creating virtually impenetrable defensive barriers. Another important innovation of the MG-42 was its quick-change barrel system. Unlike water-cooled machine guns, which were heavy and complex, the MG-42 featured a lighter and more practical design, making it easier to handle and increasing its efficiency in combat. So these two things, combined with very solid engineering, mean that not many German soldiers could actually cause serious problems for many Allied soldiers. And this is really summed up in the experience and claims of Heinrich Severloh, who wrote his memoirs, published them in 2000, and claimed to have killed between 1,000 and 2,000 American soldiers on Omaha Beach. The Allies had planned a fierce naval bombardment, followed by an Allied bomber strike that would destroy the strong defenses before the first wave of troops reached the beach at 6:30 in the morning. But the bombardment was inadequate, and the bombers missed most of their targets, leaving the German defenses still standing. To make matters worse at Omaha, the concept of the DD tanks, which would float and swim to the shore, ended in disaster. The 741st Tank Battalion launched most of its DD tanks about 5,000 meters from the shore. Almost immediately, 27 of the 32 tanks sank due to bad weather and rough seas. Things also did not go as planned for the infantry. Strong winds and currents diverted many of the landing craft off course, and some were flooded, drowning the heavily burdened soldiers inside them. Other landing craft hit sandbars that forced the infantry to wade across the beach in water, often up to their necks, greatly extending the time they were exposed to enemy fire. The situation became so dangerous that General Omar Bradley, commander of the United States Ground Forces, briefly considered halting the landings at Omaha and diverting assault forces to Utah Beach. However, slowly, small groups of men began to find gaps in the defenses, and by nightfall, the situation finally began to stabilize. By the end of the day, 34,000 troops had landed at Omaha, at the cost of more than 2,400 men killed, wounded, or missing. By far, the highest cost in human lives of any of the 5 invasion beaches. An hour after the beginning of the American, British, Canadian, and Free French assault troop landings in the eastern sector of the Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, the 50th Division faced strong German resistance at Gold Beach. Although it managed to advance significantly beyond the beach, the division did not reach all of its planned objectives. At Juno, Canadian forces made the deepest advances in Normandy of any Allied formation after intense house-to-house fighting, and likewise, at Sword Beach, the initial attack went largely as planned. This bombardment was carried out by the largest naval bombardment fleet among those supporting the 5 beaches, so the weight of firepower was immense. Most of the DD tanks reached the beach almost at the same time as the infantry, giving the latter the necessary fire support and cover to advance on the beach. The funnies immediately began clearing paths through obstacles and minefields, filling trenches, and then engaging enemy strongpoints with their heavy petard mortars. Although many were hit and destroyed, their surviving crews dismounted and cleared obstacles by hand. Within 2 hours of the landing, 7 of the 8 beach exits were cleared. Of course, this doesn't mean the Sword Beach attack was easy. One of the German strongpoints on Sword Beach, called Cod, took 3 hours to be captured, with 2 of the attacking battalions suffering 25% casualties each. Still, the battle for Sword Beach was relatively quick, and by the end of D-Day, nearly 29,000 troops had landed. During the early hours of the beach landings, with the exception of Omaha, the Allies generally managed to overcome the German defenders, who were largely undermanned, stretched thin, and poorly prepared. The big question was, how would the German panzers respond? As unbelievable as it may seem, the massive Allied invasion force approaching the Normandy coast on June 5th went almost unnoticed by the Germans. Thanks to the bad weather in the previous days, an invasion was simply not expected at the time. Rommel was visiting his family in Germany, while most of the senior commanders in the invasion sector were, ironically, out on an anti-invasion training exercise when the blow fell. The first major counterattack took place on D-Day itself. That afternoon, the 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored formation in the area, advanced between the British and Canadian forces, reaching the coast. But due to mistaken command decisions, confused communications, and the weight of Allied firepower, the attack was repelled, with the 21st Panzer losing more than half of its 124 tanks. The rest of the German armor was under Hitler's direct control, but he was sleeping until the afternoon, after having worked late the night before. When informed, he reportedly reacted with joy. However, both Hitler and Rundstedt still believed that the landings in Normandy were a diversion, and that the main blow would come at Calais. Elements of Panzer Group West were released for use in Normandy, but it was already too late. A full-force German counterattack would have to wait. Instead, on D-Day itself, the Allies' biggest challenge was supply. While the mulberry harbors were being built, supplies still had to be unloaded directly onto the beaches in vehicles like this DUKW, or Duck. An amphibious six-wheeled truck, the Duck was a valuable piece of the Allied war machine. However, they struggled in the rough waters of the channel. The rising tide also caused major problems, reducing the beach depth, which caused men, vehicles, and equipment to crowd together, restricting movement off the beach and providing good targets for German snipers. The Allies had almost total control of the skies, and thus, while Panzer Group West was moving toward Normandy, they were constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers, to the point that they had to abandon daytime movement. Elsewhere, members of the French resistance tried to delay German reinforcements, and although they met with some success, the local population suffered brutal reprisals. All of this delayed and disorganized the German response. When it came, it was the 12th SS Panzer Division from Panzer Group West that made the greatest effort, attacking the Canadian 3rd Division on D+1, but the Allies were well prepared. The Canadian 3rd Division had twice the normal amount of field artillery and the same number of gunners in its order of battle as infantrymen. This Sexton self-propelled gun was one of those weapons. With its 25-pounder cannon, it was able to provide mobile fire support for British and Canadian forces in Normandy. Assisted by Allied warships offshore, the overwhelming Allied firepower was able to put an end to the German counterattacks. When the Panzer Lehr Division arrived to join the attack on D+2, the momentum had already been lost, and instead of counterattacking, they were forced to dig in to block Allied attempts to take Caen. On June 12th, the Allies captured Carrington, linking all 5 beaches. With a steady stream of men and equipment pouring into their vast beachhead every day, any German hope of pushing the invaders back into the sea was foolish. Hitler's chance for a counterattack had vanished. Finally, here are some general considerations about D-Day logistical problems on D-Day. Landing heavy equipment and supplies on the beach was hampered by terrain, large waves, and bad weather. This prevented rapid advancement, forcing the Allies to operate with an irregular flow of essential supplies. The construction of the Mulberry Harbor was an attempt to solve this issue, but logistical difficulties remained a significant challenge. Difficulties of the first airborne attack waves by the 101st Division. Poor visibility and bad weather hindered the work of pathfinders and guidance equipment for the paratroopers, causing chaos on the field. The battle for Caen. The city of Caen was one of the main objectives for the Allies on D-Day, but German resistance and bottlenecks on the beaches delayed the Allied advance. The city remained under German control for several weeks after the landing, but the fight for its capture was an important milestone in the Normandy campaign. The destruction of DD tanks on D-Day. Only 5 tanks managed to land successfully. Others sank due to bad weather and sea conditions. Failures in the Allied bombardment. The aerial and naval bombardment was uncoordinated and failed to destroy several German defenses, leaving them fully operational. The German response and counterattack. The German response to the Allied landing was slow and disorganized. Initially, the Germans did not believe the invasion was real, and many commanders were outside the area at the time of the attack. The response was further hampered by a lack of coordination among the forces and a shortage of armored and air support. When they finally mobilized, the Germans were unable to mount an effective counterattack, especially due to the Allies' air and naval superiority. The impact of the French resistance. The French resistance played an important role in delaying the movement of German troops and sabotaging incoming reinforcements. The resistance helped destabilize the German response and ensure that the Allies had an advantage on the ground. D-Day was not the immediate turning point of the war, but it was an essential step for the Allied advance in Europe. It began the Western offensive, while the Red Army was already advancing in the east, pressuring Germany from both sides. The success of the invasion ensured that the Allies had a solid position to push toward Paris and eventually achieve final victory over the Nazi regime. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.